Likutei Sichos, Chelek of Zayin, volume 27, the first Sicha for Parshas Behar. This Sicha will explain how the legal concept, the halachic concept regarding the laws of transaction, how it relates to our avodas Hashem, our service of Hashem, in other words, our relationship with Hashem. So first of all, as an introduction, first of all, to understand the connection to our parsha. In our parsha, in chapter 25, verse 24, it says, if you sell something to your compatriot, or you buy something from one, and the Torah goes into the details of how we go about the laws of transaction. And on this, the Talmud spends a lot of time explaining the various details of kinyan. Get used to this term, kinyan, the laws of transaction. Now, generally speaking, once somebody has done an act of acquisition, aka kinyan, you cannot go back on it. In other words, there's no such thing as buyer remorse, unless, of course, the other party agrees. But the law is, once you've done an act of acquisition, even if you didn't give the money yet, even if the seller did not receive the full payment yet, the fact that you made a kinyan, it's final. You cannot change, and this is enforceable. What happens, however, if somebody just makes a commitment? Say he says, I'm going to buy this item without having made a kinyan. Well, the law is, of course, the Torah says you have to keep your word. But that's not enforceable because I didn't do anything to obligate me, to establish, so to speak, a transfer of ownership. Now, what happens if somebody sells, let's say, something which is not currently here? And this is the concept of ein Adam makne davar shelei ba'al olam. Literally translated, a person cannot sell, a person cannot transfer ownership of something that is not yet here in the world. For example, somebody comes and says, I'm going to sell you the fruit that this tree will bear. Well, the halacha is, and the person says, yes, I'll buy it. The halacha is that it's not sold. If I change my mind, there is no way that the courts can enforce it and force me to give it to this person who I sold it to. Why? Because at the time that I was doing this acquisition, there was nothing to do a kinyan on. The thing didn't exist. However, what happens if I make a kinyan guf leperes, meaning I say to him, I am leasing you the trees, not that the trees belong to you. You cannot go and chop the trees down, for example. However, it's going to be yours for the benefit of what these trees will produce. Then, since I sold him I gave him ownership to a degree in the actual guf, the actual body that produces these fruits, then it is sold to him, and I cannot renege. I cannot go back on it. It's obvious that if I sell him the tree itself permanently, well, sure, it's his. That's an actual kinyan. Then he can do whatever he wants. He can chop the tree down if he wants. So that's another point in the introduction to get familiar with, so we better understand the Sicha. So we can understand the Sicha and flow through it better. Now, several verses or expressions that are mentioned in the Talmud to familiarize ourselves with, to get a better appreciation of the idea that our connection with Hashem, our service of Hashem, is likened to the idea, the concept of kinyan, of acquisition. First of all, the Talmud says, Ani nivresi l'shamishes koini. I am created. Every Jew has to say that was created in order to serve, to worship koini. Now, what does koini mean? You hear the word kinyan. It doesn't say as boiri, my creator, but rather koini, the one who acquires me. So you see already that relationship between us and Hashem has a certain tone of acquisition. In the book of Yeshayahu, he speaks about the future, he speaks about the coming of Mashiach, and he says, Bayoimahu, in that day, Yosef Adna Yoit, that Hashem will go above and beyond and do more, and what will he do? Once again, Liknois es she'er amai. He will go back to acquire the remnants of his people. So you see again the word of acquisition. And then, of course, something we say every single day in the Oz Yasher, which our ancestors sang after experiencing the great miracle of the splitting of the sea. We say, Ad Yaver Amcha Hashem, Ad Yaver Amzu Konisa. Until your nation, Hashem, passes, until this nation which you have acquired passes. So again, we see the lashon of kinyan. Another thing to be familiar with, we have the idea of gavra and chefza, which you've had in the past. Meaning, in every mitzvah, typically you have two aspects. You have the aspect of the chefza, the object itself. Sometimes that's more of the emphasis in the mitzvah. And then you have the gavra, the person doing the mitzvah. There are times when the actual effect, so to speak, is on the object, or obligation is on the object, and then there are times when it's more on the individual. Another thing to be familiar with, the concept of eved, a servant, a slave. According to Torah law, the actual slave, the guf, is a kinyan haguf. The actual slave belongs to the master to the extent that whatever the slave acquires belongs to the master. It's like an extension, like a long arm extension of the master himself. Another thing to be familiar with, the idea of a Beinani. A Beinani, as mentioned in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says, what is a Beinani? It's somebody that's not totally transformed and has no Yetzer Hara. However, his Yetzer Hara is so dormant, is so subdued, is so to speak, asleep, that he had never committed a sin, isn't committing sins, and will not be committing sins, is not capable of committing any sins, as we'll see later in the Sicha. Finally, the idea, the concept of shliach and mishaleach, a messenger, an emissary, somebody who's tasked with do something on behalf of someone else. Now, although they are two separate people, but in a sense, in a halachic sense, the shliach becomes representative of the mishaleach. Even though the shliach is a separate person, he's another person, he doesn't eat the same food, he breathes through a different set of lungs, his blood is flowing through a different separate set of a separate heart, separate pump, different mind, a mind of his own. But when he's on that mission, the shliach is full representation of the mishaleach, of the one who sent him, as if he is him. In fact, one more thing. The service of a person to Hashem, of a yid to Hashem, basically can be divided in two sections, in two categories. You have the actual Torah mitzvahs, things that we're obligated to do. And then you have what's called divrei harishus. That would fall into like all various things that are typically the common, normal, day-to-day activity of the person, where a person doesn't have a direct obligation or an actual obligation to fulfill, yet the person takes his own personal life, so to speak, his own personal endeavors, and elevates them to Hashem from his own personal things. Let's go into the Sicha. So there's a rule in the laws of Kinyan, laws of acquisition, that ein adam makna davar shlei b'laylam. A person cannot fully transform ownership, can fully be makna something which is not yet in the world, and therefore, if it's not currently here, and therefore, if the person reneges, there's nothing really you can do to enforce it. However, if somebody is makna, like we said in the introduction, a guf for the Paris, that means it's like he's leasing, he sells you the body of the tree, not for the tree itself, not for you to own it itself, but for the purpose of what it produces that should belongs to you, then it is a kinyan, because you didn't just sell the fruits that are not here, the tree is actually here right now, and that you are able to sell. Says the Rambam on this, amazing chidush, a novelty, that this all applies only by ordinary transactions. He says, din hedyoit, of ordinary people. However, if this transaction, if this kinyan was done in regards to hektish, let's say to sanctifying something to Hashem, or if it's regarding the support of the poor, meaning tzedakah, or vows, then even if somebody said, for example, whatever my cow will give birth to, whatever it will give birth to, that will belong to Hektish, or that I'm giving to Tzedakah. Then although that the actual item was not here, and therefore the actual item was not yet sanctified, the actual item did not yet become actual tzedakah, because it didn't exist, it's not here. There's no power that we have as humans to impose hektish, kedusha, or tzedakah on something that's not yet here. It's only going to be here in the future. We don't have control of the future. But yet, says the Rambam, the person is obligated to fulfill his word, meaning he's obligated to fulfill his commitment, because it says that a person should always, whatever comes out of his mouth in regards to hektish or tzedakah or vows, he must keep his word, and this is enforceable. So, as the Rebbe says, as we have many times spoken in the past, every halacha in the Torah, in addition to its literal application, also has the aspect of Torah. Torah means hira'ah, of a directive, of a lesson in our service of Hashem. That means even if we never get to actually fulfill this halacha in the literal sense, but in a spiritual sense, in a sense of avodas Hashem, it certainly applies to us, and we certainly have to examine it to learn from it what we should do in our avodah of Hashem. So therefore, likewise, in our subject here, there are two aspects, there are two matters to this law, to this rule. Number one, as we stated, the difference between selling the actual fruits versus selling the tree for the fruits. And then again, the point of the Rambam that all this applies only to ordinary transactions, but not when it comes to regards of hektish, of sanctimonious things, those things that are mukdash to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, how does this apply to us? Says the Rebbe, in general, the general idea of our service of Hashem is that, so to speak, we make acts of acquisition. That is, we are being makne to Hashem. We transform ownership to Hashem, in this case, ourselves, and everything that we possess, that everything that I have, everything that I am, should belong to Hashem and be in His full, total ownership. How do we do this? How do we achieve this? Well, by our conduct. That it should always be in line, constantly, with the will of Hashem. And perhaps this is the emphasis of the saying of the sages, Ani nivresi lishamish koini, that I was, quote, created in order to serve my acquirer, my koini. Again, the idea of sale, the idea of acquisition. Because when a person serves Hashem, he is kind of transforming ownership of everything that seems to belong to him, including himself, to Hashem. And indeed, the ultimate revelation of this will be, the ultimate fulfillment of this will be, and materialization, when Mashiach comes, like we said, that we quoted in the introduction, the verse from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah, that says that Hashem will come back to acquire the remnants of His people. Or, like it says in the Yaz Yashir, Ad Yavar Am Hashem, Ad Yavar Amzu Konisa, this nation that you have acquired. Meaning that we constantly, so to speak, sell or gift to Hashem ourselves, our things, and Hashem is constantly, so to speak, in the act of acquiring us. And the ultimate stage of it will be, of course, when Mashiach comes. Now, in this act of acquisition, in this act of sale or gifting to Hashem, in this kinyan that we do to Hashem through our Avodah, there are two manners. There is, as we said, the kinyan Paris, the acquisition of the fruits, meaning the things that the thing produces, and then there is the actual guf, the actual body of the thing that is kani to Hashem. Let's see how it applies, how it fit in to our relationship with Hashem. So if it's a kinyan haguf, the actual thing is acquired to Hashem, that means that a person is gives over totally his soul, his body, and all its properties. That's the intellect, the emotions, the thought, the speech, that it all exclusively belongs to Hashem. Then there is only kinyan Paris, that the thing itself doesn't exclusively belong to Hashem. Unfortunately, it's stuck down here in this world, so to speak. However, in the actual actions of the person, which is like the peros, the fruits, the produce of these things, of his soul, of his body, of his thoughts, of his emotions, the actual, so to speak, fruits of them, well, those are given over to Hashem. Those are sold to Hashem. That when the person, that it's all in line with Hashem. So we understand that that's fantastic, but it's still not like kinyan haguf. Because at the end of the day, when you're just giving Hashem the fruits, so to speak, you yourself have not been transformed. The person himself isn't perfect. The person himself is not where, so to speak, belonging to Hashem, where it's supposed to be. But, however, the fruits, the results, so to speak, that the actions that come out from the soul and the body, well, they are, so to speak, belonging to Hashem. What is the idea of the body itself, meaning the actual thing itself, that's the soul, the body, the emotions, are so to speak, transformed ownership to Hashem, konu to Hashem, well, that would be the idea that even one's thoughts and even one's emotions are totally transformed, and that they're not even capable, not possible at all, that they should ever do something that is not in line 100% with Hashem. Now, of course, when there is a total kinyan haguf, as we just described, then automatically the person produces only good fruits, quote unquote. Meaning everything he'll do will always be in line that with Hashem. There's nothing to worry about. Why? Because since he's entirely owned by Hashem, he's entirely transformed. So obviously, if the thing itself is in totally in line with Hashem, then everything it produces, everything it does, everything that comes out of it will be with Hashem. And this is, by the way, the idea of why we find that a tzaddik, somebody who's totally transformed themselves, and their whole existence, their whole being is in line with Hashem's will, why they're referred to as Eved Hashem, a slave, a servant of Hashem. Because as we said in the introduction, because an Eved is Kinyan Haguf. The Eved himself, not just what he does, not just his time and his energy. The Eved itself, the body of the Eved belongs to the master. And so too over here, when you have a Kinyan Haguf, the tzaddik is totally in possession of Hashem. But when it's only Kinyan HaPeiros, then it's not like that. The person is an individual. The person is separate from Hashem. It's just that they strive to give, so to speak, the fruits, the actions that they give should be in line of Hashem. Based on this, we'll appreciate what this means when we say, Ein Adam Makne Dovashay B'Elohim, that a person cannot transform ownership, cannot be makne something that's not yet here. You see, somebody who is not makne his entire body, his entire existence to Hashem, so when he makes, let's say, a resolution or a decision, a commitment that he's going to do something, he's going to do such and such for Hashem, there's no guarantee. Why? Because there's no kinyan. You cannot consider it done. Why? Because his control over himself only extends to what he's actually producing. That means when in real time, when he does something good, yes, that is proof that right now he produced, so to speak, something good for Hashem. His fruits are in line with Hashem. But however, since his body, his whole essence, his existence is not acquired one exclusively to Hashem, therefore, any time that a challenge arises, he has to start fighting it from anew. He has to start fighting it anew. However, what can such a person do? Even somebody who's not totally a konui to Hashem, there's a trick that he can do. He can do is, as we said, to be makne the guf for the peres. Meaning, how you makne the guf for the peres? That means it's not a total ownership of Hashem. He doesn't, so to speak, a total transformation of ownership, a total kinyan. But it's just like a partial kinyan. He owns the tree for the fruits. How does that apply here? That when a person works on himself, that he tries his best to refine his intellect, his emotions, that the bad that's in them, the potential for bad should always be dormant, as if it's sleeping. It shouldn't be active. Along the lines that the Alter Rebbe says that even somebody, a Beinoni that is, that Beinoni by definition is somebody who does not succeed to totally transform himself, to transform his bad to good, like a tzaddik does, which is the total sale of the body. But rather, it's just that he doesn't actually act on the bad. Why? He says the Alter Rebbe, because he affects the bad in his body, that it should be in a state of sleeping. What happens when somebody sleeps? Everything is there. Everything potentially is able to function, but it doesn't function. It's all dormant. So his mind, his emotions, and so on, they're there. There's nothing stopped them. They're still alive, but they're not functioning. Like an example for this is when the Beinoni, for example, when he davens, the Alter Rebbe explains, when he's praying, there, what does he do? He gives over his whole ava, his love, his desire, he gives over to Hashem. That it gets totally transformed in that time of the davening, that it totally belongs to Hashem. However, right after davening, he's back to being who he is. Now he's not actively giving over his ava. But since during davening, he gave his love to Hashem, the lingering effect of it is such that throughout the day, his love / desires are hopefully in line with Hashem. Not that it's in essence transformed, but the effect of the davening lingers on throughout the day, that he will not love and desire negative things or things that are not aligned with Hashem's desires, with Hashem's wants. Rather, he does what Hashem wants. So they're really restrained. They're dear, but they're restrained. And this also gives us better insight in how the Alter Rebbe categorizes the Beinoni, when he says it's not only somebody who never ever did an Avera, but somebody that never will do an Avera. How can you say such a thing? How can we make such a statement that a Beinoni is somebody who will never do an Avera, but he has the bad? In essence, the bad is still there, and he hasn't taken it away. He hasn't totally transformed it. Because the answer is the way he now controls and has total domination over his Yetzer Hara, this is an indicator that since he sold his guf, his emotions, his thoughts, his energies, he, so to speak, sold it. He was makne to the Eibishter, to Hashem. So he gave, so to speak, control to Hashem, at least partial control, over the Yetzer Hara that's in him, over the bad that's in him. And therefore, what it will produce is not what the Yetzer Hara wants it to produce, but since the Yetzer Hara is subdued, it's going to produce only good. But by the end of the day, this is not a total transformation, and therefore, so to speak, the guf is not sold. The actual person is not totally sold and transformed. He's not a tzaddik, but however, he is, what he gains is that it's like a partial transformation. It's a partial or a full subduing of the Yetzer Hara that's still there, but now the peiros that are produced are guaranteed to produce the right thing. So in short, even though the person cannot succeed to do a full kinyan haguf, a full kinyan of the body itself, of the person itself, he cannot fully transform, become a tzaddik, but yet everybody has to strive, being that we are all shluchim of Hashem. So what's the idea? In other words, why is this really okay? Why is it if we're a Beinoni, we're still fully and absolutely serving Hashem? Because if you think of the concept of shlichus, what is it saying? Like we said in the introduction, there are two separate bodies here. There are two separate entities. But when I become a shliach of the Mishaleach, I become one with the Mishaleach. So in this case, the same thing. Even though the kinyan is limited to kinyan guf for the peiros, it's not a full, in total, and absolute kinyan. It's only like a partial kinyan. It's only, like we said, you're only subduing the bad that's in you. But still, because I'm doing it, and I did make a kinyan which holds and has an effect, I made a kinyan to Hashem, and I'm subduing myself to Hashem. In other words, I'm becoming His shliach to do His will, to implement His desires in this world. Therefore, I become like one with the Meshalech. It's not fully one, but it's like one. Now, here comes the novelty of the ruling of the Rambam. The Rambam says that even somebody is not even capable of this. What we just described is a very high level. Not even capable of this. But yet, when it comes outright to matters of Torah mitzvahs, aka hektish, matters of holiness, this, once a person makes a commitment, this sets an obligation on the gavra, on the person. Perhaps the actual chefza, the matter of the mitzvah, is not there to be imposed on this kinyan. But the person now becomes, so to speak, obligated. And when you become obligated, it gives you also, besides the incentive to do it, it also gives you the energy, the potential to be able to do it. When Hashem obligates us with something, He gives us the potential to do it. So, see, but when it comes to matters, regular matters, that you're trying to commit yourself to Hashem, there, at the end of the day, it's your things. It's you. The guf is you. And you're not, like we said, you're not even on the level to be makne the guf for the peiros. But when it comes to matters of Torah mitzvahs, of Kedusha, that are Hashem's matters. That already is something that belongs to Hashem. That is hektish. And therefore, when you make somewhat of a commitment, Hashem gives you the power to implement it. So, in other words, so one makes a hachlata, one makes a resolution regarding their own private matters, there's no guarantee that it'll hold. But when you do it regarding things that Hashem wants us to do in terms of outright Torah mitzvahs, since this quote-unquote belongs to Hashem, then it's as if Hashem already acquired it. It's as if already it's happening. You have that extra guarantee that it's going to happen, and therefore you could be certain you're assured that Hashem will provide you the means to implement it. Hashem will give you the means. Yes, there is a guarantee that you will do it. Now, by person working on this concept, on this idea of kinyan, as to the extent that we can, to one's fullest ability, which is the idea to be makne yourself, to quote-unquote sell yourself, to quote-unquote make the acquisition, the transfer of ownership of you and your own things in this world to Hashem. Through this will come the ultimate fulfillment, as it says in Yeshayahu, "Bayomahu Yosef Adna Shainis," that Hashem will go ahead once again and gather His people, liknoi she'er amoi, to acquire. Hashem will make the ultimate act of acquisition and bring us all back home. And this will also be the ultimate completion of that verse that we say in Az Yashir, that the process of which began when they left Mitzrayim, and that's why it says it in the pasuk. It breaks it up into two separate stanzas. It says Ad Yavar Amcha Hashem, until your nation passes, and then it says Ad Yavar Amzukanisa, until the nation that you acquired passes. Why does it say that way? Because Ad Yavar Amcha Hashem is coming into Eretz Yisrael the first time, but it wasn't a complete and absolute acquisition. When Mashiach comes, it's going to be full and absolute.